Hello. Okay, so welcome to the book launch for Absolutization, which is the first volume of the new Middle Way Philosophy series. So basically this session is going to consist of a talk about the book, about the approach in the book, and how I came to write it a little bit. Well, at least I'm aiming for maybe about 40-45 minutes for the talk, but that's maybe pretty flexible. And then I want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion after that. So if you do have any questions as we go on, then I suggest you make a note of them and ask them at the end. So yeah, I'm going to welcome any critical perspectives. Any challenging questions will be absolutely fine, because that's what the book is about. So yeah, first of all, I'm going to say a little bit about the overall context of this book, because it's more significant for me than just another book. It's the first of the new Middle Way Philosophy series. And then I'll say a little bit about what absolutization is and the idea of a basic problem demanding a solution. And then obviously go into more about the different dimensions of absolutization, which the book explores. Obviously, with a book of this complexity, I can only give you a taste of it in the time available. Okay, so a little bit about the context, first of all. So I've been working on Middle Way philosophy since 1997, which was when I started work on a PhD thesis at Lancaster University, on a hunch that the Middle Way was important as a way of understanding or resolving the conflict between absolutism and relativism. That was my initial focus. So it was a PhD in philosophy in the philosophy department, but it rapidly became a very interdisciplinary PhD, which ended up being 3 times the normal length and breaking lots of rules, which I eventually did manage to get away with. Anyway, so that was a way of exploring developing a model of the Middle Way initially, as not just a Buddhist approach or Buddhist theory, although obviously they owed a lot to Buddhism in its initial conception. And my background previously had been in Buddhist practice, Western Buddhism. But I increasingly found that it could be used as a model not only for justifying moral approaches, finding the most justifiable moral approaches, but also even for scientific approaches and for practice, providing a framework for practice across the board. So it became obviously a unifying type of theory, but one with a practical focus. So it's not so much attempting to explaining everything, but so much as providing a justification for an approach to judgment. So judgment is a key focus in Middle Way philosophy. So judgment is like the coal face, if you like, or the place of makes a difference, where at each moment we can make a difference in how we approach things. Obviously, a lot of things feed into a given judgment in terms of our habits and our past conditions and so on. So my approach to this gradually began to include more and more perspectives, which I found actually enriched my understanding of the Middle Way. So particularly quite early on, I became interested. Well, I looked at the Western philosophical canon. A lot of my PhD was about that, but I also intertwined a lot of psychology. I had a previous background in religious studies, including Buddhism, And I was also very struck from an early stage by what I prefer to call the embodied meaning thesis. So the work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson from the 1980s in the putting forward the way that we should understand meaning as embodied, which is often misleadingly labeled cognitive linguistics. Anyway, so that fed into it. There was also a political aspect to it. And then as time has gone on, since the PhD, I've also got increasingly into neuroscience and general systems theory as key elements in the approach. So that's why I call it interdisciplinary, I think, some justification. So the middle way approach, as I say, is not just a Buddhist approach, but it can include and I think enrich a Buddhist approach, a Buddhist practice. It's not a metaphysical approach, and I'll talk about metaphysics later. It's not quite a theory of everything because it's so practically focused. Practice is the test of it. And criticality is also very important in it. So I don't just aim to construct a theory that sort of seems convincing, but also one that can address the concerns that people raise from different perspectives. So my work on that has gone through three major phases. So it began with the PhD thesis, which I mentioned, which was completed in 2001. And then I continued to work on middle way philosophy, perhaps not so intensively for the first 10 years or so after my PhD, because I was also full-time teaching for a while. But by the 2010s or so, I was ready to develop a new expression, to develop so much and change so much that I wanted to give a comprehensive expression to where I got to with the whole theory. So that was the original, what we call the old middle way philosophy series, which, for lack of a better outlet, I self-published between 2012 and 2015. So that's still available and will be for maybe another year or so with the under the title Middle Way Philosophy 1, 2, 3, and 4, and also in an omnibus edition. Now, as time went on, I became increasingly aware of the limitations of that series, but it was quite a comprehensive attempt at the time to pull together all the different strands of middle way philosophy. But of course, the main drawback with it was that it was self-published, thus didn't reach many people, still hasn't reached many people. So hence the new middle way philosophy series. So in recent years, I've been working on a series of books published by Equinox, which are more focused on specific audiences. So I've written more for Buddhists and for Jungians, my last 4 books. But I'm immensely pleased now to be able to actually publish a new version of the middle way philosophy series. So the core approach with Equinox, because obviously it's a risk for a publisher to bring out something like this with this amount of detail, which is trying to sort of stake out a new direction. So what I've in outline agreed with Equinox is to publish a series of probably 9 books, but there needs to be some sort of flexibility in this. So 9 books are planned in the new series. And the new series is largely a complete rewrite, but it includes some of the points in the old series, obviously. It updates it and it completely reformats it in what I hope is a better way. So the new series follows the broad pattern of, well, problem solution. So the first 2 volumes are problem solution. So this first volume is what's the problem? Trying to clarify what the problem is, and some overall approaches in the second half to, or what the criteria for looking for a solution might be. So very broadly in the second half of this book. But the solutions then, the rest of the series is much more focused on solutions, which are obviously of practical value. So the second volume is, which is already written, is called The 5 Principles of Middle Way Philosophy. And that's very much focused on practice and justification of practice. And I see that as kind of the core focused book of the whole series, because that's the obviously the positive approach is the most important bit, but in this case I need to make clear what the problem was before I suggested that solution to it. So the remaining books of the series will be looking at more detailed aspects of the solution. So there will be books, as I envisage, on the history and biology of the middle way. That's the 3rd volume. There'll be a book on meaning, a book on bias, a book on philosophical dualisms, a more philosophically focused book on how to resolve absolutism and relativism and lots of other opposed isms. There'll be a book on aesthetics, a book on ethics, and finally a book on politics. So, of course, I might die before I get through all that, but that's my intention at the moment. And to be honest, a lot of that material is already written in some form or another, so it's not like starting from scratch. It might seem like a huge amount of work. It seems manageable to me. But it will take quite a few years to bring out that whole series. Okay, so that's an outline of the situation, just so you can see that this book is not an isolated thing. Yeah, it's the beginning of the series, and it has a positive context in a way. So although it's negative in its focus, it is leading on to a solution. Just as I suppose one of my sources of inspiration, obviously, here is the Buddhist tradition, and they have a similar kind of problem solution focus in the way the Four Noble Truths are traditionally articulated. You start with clarifying what the problem is, and then you think, how do we deal with this? Okay, so let me get on then to the main content of this book, which you could take as an answer to the question, what is the basic problem? Now, I don't think the problem can be completely separated from the solution, which is one reason why it's part of the Middle Way Philosophy series. Obviously, the problem needs identifying before the solution, but actually the problem is also understood and defined in relation to the solution. You can't separate the two completely, they're part of the same system. Because they're both really embedded in human experience, or should be, then that's another reason why we can't just abstractly define each in a vacuum. So there are lots and lots of different views of excuse me, of what our basic problem is as human beings. I think they're all, I see them as quite partial views. So here's just a few examples to throw out, which will probably be familiar to you from different sources. So sin, suffering, capitalism, it's all capitalism's fault, ignorance, mental illness, separation from nature, that's been quite a hot one recently. Selfishness is an ongoing one. So those are some common things people might say. If you ask people, what's humanity's basic problem? They might say things like that, depending on their background. So I think all of those do identify some key conditions that create a basic problem for us, but they miss out others. So one's identification of the problem really depends on our focus. What do we choose to include, and what is it most helpful to include? And I think the most adequate account will be the widest one we can manage. So simply because, well, there's a basic issue with conditions. Yeah? So in order to deal with the world around us, we have to deal with the conditions it throws up. And the more conditions we can take into account, the better, the more flexible, the more helpful our theory will be. I think the most adequate account will also be practical. So it needs to be focused on what makes a difference. So that hence the focus on judgment. And it will need to avoid dogmatic assumptions, even where these are widespread. So that's what I'm thinking is a practical account of the problem, focused at the point of judgment where we make a difference at each point. So hence I'm not satisfied with general descriptions of a state of the world, so like suffering, for example, or approaches that depend very much for their description on some sort of dogmatic source, so like the account of seeing Christianity, so particularly original sin. We need a practical judgment-focused account, but that doesn't mean that the prior conditions that influence our judgment aren't important. Of course, they are very important. That's a lot of what helps to form our judgment. So practice in the Buddhist sense, it's very much about working with the conditions before we make a judgment so that we're in best state to make a good judgment. So something like mindfulness, for example, is not directly about, well, actually do make judgments in the course of mindfulness practice, but probably the main benefit of it is that it helps your judgment subsequently, it influences your judgment in a positive way. There's also an issue of responsibility in the whole thing. So it's easy to say all our problems are our fault, or they're someone else's fault, or they're fated, they're a result of external conditions. Obviously, we need to try and do justice to the complex interaction between all the different conditions that create our problems. So the most helpful focus is on what we can change by chipping away at the conditions we can influence. But within that sort of area of what we can change, some things are sort of practically obvious. Yeah, well, let's take a couple of examples before I go on there. So the need to address climate change, for example, is fairly practically obvious to a lot of people at the moment in the world. Or on a more personal level, something like, if you had an addiction, serious addiction, then that will be pretty obvious, particularly to people around you, probably to you, that you needed to do something about it. So things can be practically obvious in that way, and yet sometimes we can't even see that. We don't see what seems so obvious from another perspective, let alone be in a position to address it, because of we can very broadly call a self-sabotaging process. So we stop ourselves from being able to understand and change things at both an individual and a social level. So it's that broadly self-sabotaging process that I think is the the most practically relevant and important thing to focus on, to reach a helpful understanding, and also to find the basis of justifiable agreements between people. So our problem doesn't lie generally in, for example, getting empirical information. So I don't think it's ignorance in the sense of a lack of information, but it's nor even in finding effective practical responses, also like having the right skills or the right technology to make use of our capacities. We've got lots of that in modern civilization anyway, but it's getting over the self-sabotage which has produced, glaring problems like climate change. So that's the reason why I'm understanding the basic problem is one about how we judge and how we self-sabotage as we judge, which I think when we identify that, the different dimensions of that self-sabotage, then all sorts of other things follow, all sorts of other understandings follow from that. Okay, so the term I use for that self-sabotaging process is absolutization, which is the title of the book. So the understanding I've tried to express in the book is one I've gradually reached through a synthetic process of looking at different perspectives on our kind of self-sabotaging tendencies, examining assumptions and examining the practical application and implications of different approaches. And I've tried out lots of different ways of understanding and applying it. So for example, in the past, earlier on in my work on real-world philosophy, I've talked a lot about metaphysics as the basic problem. And obviously, that kind of emphasis, though, makes people immediately focus on philosophy and argue about philosophy and argue about what metaphysics means and all sorts of things like that. And that means they tend to miss all the other dimensions there are to the problem, even though I always thought they were sort of implicit in the idea of metaphysics. So I don't tend to foreground metaphysics these days, although I will talk about it later as an aspect of the problem. So absolutization seems to me a much better term because it hasn't been used very widely so far, but it's kind of understandable for what the overall problem is, binding together the philosophical and psychological and neuroscientific and systems and so on, all those different aspects of it. So my broad, rough definition of absolutization is the assumption that we have the whole story. So when we think we have the whole story, our judgment is sabotaged, or it's narrowed, or it's limited by the assumption that that judgment is final, or it's unconditional, or it's essential, or it's necessary, or it's true in an absolute sense. So yeah, there are all sorts of different ways absolutization can be expressed. We're already getting into the multifaceted aspects of it. But all of them involve this having the whole story, if you want to try and simplify it a bit. So yeah, given that we're human, our judgment is only ever made on the basis of limited experiences and assumptions. And absolutization, thinking that we have the whole story at any given moment, stops us from taking into account what we don't understand, or what we don't recall at that point, or what we don't value. Forgetting that we have limited information, forgetting that we have shifting mental states and we felt differently about that yesterday, and so on. So that constantly restricts us from making use of good judgment in the circumstances we find ourselves. Okay, so that's very broadly what I mean by absolutization. So the book goes into the different dimensions of absolutization. Well, I should say the first sort of long half of the book goes into 23 dimensions of absolutization. That isn't kind of a magic number I started off with, it's just the number that I ended up with, as it were. So the 23 dimensions, and they're organized in the book into 5 broad disciplinary approaches. So you'll see that the first 5 sections try to give people a kind of orientation by where they start, the kinds of discussions or disciplines they start in, generally. Although actually a lot of it all the way through is very interdisciplinary. So the first section is called Early Buddhism, for example, because that's the prime inspiration for the stuff I start with there. Then there's a section on systems theory, a section on embodied meaning, which includes brain lateralization, which is also very important there. A section on the philosophy, which includes all the stuff about metaphysics, and a section on psychology. So that's the way in which the 23 dimensions is absolutized, the way of trying to help people find a way through it, as it were. And the idea is, obviously, if you do have some sort of background in at least one of those 5 areas, then hopefully you'll relate to the approach found there, and maybe you can then connect it to the others. So in the later part of the book, which I'm not going to talk about much really in this talk, but there are also 4 features of any effective response that I think emerge from the 23 dimensions. So I think, I suppose I feel at the moment that it's challenging enough in this talk to try and get across the 23 dimensions. So I'm not going to talk really about the 4 criteria, but if you read the book, you will find those once you've worked your way through the 23 dimensions. So I'm trying to pull together different perspectives on absolutization in those 5 approaches. Obviously, it's easy to say, well, why do we need all these approaches? You know, because it's sort of clear enough, as far as I'm concerned, from the perspective I'm looking at it from. So, for example, the Buddhist perspective. And I think that's probably okay as far as it goes. So that perspective may be very helpful in some conditions, and those may be the conditions you're in. But any one of those perspectives is going to begin to show its limitations in other conditions. So it's all about how flexible you want to be and how wide an understanding you want to work on. And there are always constraints, I think, or assumptions that also get into any of those perspectives that can then be questioned in terms of the practical value. Okay, so to try and give you a sort of initial orientation in the 23 dimensions, I'm going to discuss a diagram which I use in the book. So the diagram, for anyone who has the book with them, is in the introduction, in the beginning of the book. I'll also share it with you. Yeah, what this tries to do, within the limitations of one diagram, one mind map, as it were, is to sort of pack in some of the key connections between ideas. So in the middle of this diagram, we have a person sitting at a table. This is just a person making a judgment. So if we imagine that person is forming an absolute belief of some kind, yeah, probably if you look towards the top left, I'll start exploring that strand of it first of all. Yeah, so the person makes a judgment at a particular moment, which assumes that they have the whole story. Yeah, so that's an absolute judgment, which could go on to then form an absolute belief. So if that judgment becomes stable, becomes the basis of other judgments, I would then start to call it an absolute belief. Whether or not the person makes it explicit, by the way. So now you can see there, first of all, there's a little hamster in a wheel, and the idea of a reinforcing feedback loop, which is one of the key things involved here, which links closely to the idea of proliferation, which comes from Buddhism. So in the Pali Canon in Buddhism, the term used is papancha, or mental proliferation. So one becomes particularly aware of this if one tries mindfulness, some sort of mindfulness practice, and has trouble with it and fails in some way. So you get into a state where something is going round and round. It could be a craving, could be a hatred or anxiety or restlessness or something like this. And when you get into that sort of state, its loopiness is very obvious, and its proliferation. So it tends to reproduce itself constantly. It goes round and round and round like a hamster in a wheel. And of course, this is very common. When you're trying to get to sleep and you're anxious about something, so you can't go to sleep. So it's a very common human condition. But we become perhaps particularly aware of it when we're trying not to do it, which is in the mindfulness practice. So what's going on here? Well, I think there are absolute beliefs at stake there. So, for example, if you're anxious about something, you're convinced that this is a problem, in a fixed way, which keeps coming back to you. But this is obviously linked in to your basic emotional drives in some way, which is where the so-called reptilian brain comes in. So these drives come in particularly from the amygdala or other parts of the reptilian brain, which provide us with either with craving or with anxiety usually. And those kinds of craving and fear particularly can be increased by stress. So we might get more of these reinforcing feedback loops for a particularly stressed state. So hence the relationship between our emotional states and the tendency to hold on to absolute beliefs, perhaps because absolute beliefs are easier in some way. So I'll get on to that in a minute. They're a quick option, which you think shortcuts, which might make things easier when you're a bit desperate. Now linked to that, just below the hamster wheel, is the idea of absolute negation, dualism, and restriction of options. So these also you can find, I think, at least implicitly in Buddhism, and particularly in the idea of the middle way. When we get wrapped up in one particular absolute belief, which we assume to be the whole story, we're also excluding the opposed belief and focusing only on those two possibilities. So third alternatives don't come into it. They're not allowed into the picture. So that's the restriction of options, which is widely recognized as a fallacy or a bias. So if when the classic example of George W. Bush once gave a speech where he said, either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. So you're restricting the options as only those two options, as either the level of hate, as either the acceptance or rejection. So both of those possibilities are absolute, and their absoluteness involves shutting out alternatives and shutting out provisionality, which is the exploration of those other alternatives, possible alternatives. So that the negation is absolute if you're rejecting, if you even think about the alternatives seem unthinkable, so you reject them automatically. So the alternatives are just as absolute as the negation of your belief is just as absolute as the positive. Okay, so those are some, I think, some key features of absolutization, which are certainly closely related to Buddhism and appear early in Buddhism and Buddhist practice, but I'm also drawing already on other sources there. Now, if we go round the diagram a bit more, clockwise, so there's projection. Now, projection is where we think perhaps the object of our craving or hatred or anxiety, whatever, is out there. Yeah, so we have a particular set of beliefs, and we assume that those beliefs are true in a particular way. Now, obviously, this quite often happens to a person, but it can happen to an object. That we believe this person's solution to all our problems, or we believe they're Satan or whatever. So projection of some kind of another seems to be a general feature of absolutization. Even if we're just fantasizing, we think, or we assume in the absolutized state that the object of our concern is true, as it were, and there's no further perspective or awareness beyond that truth or falsehood dichotomy. You could also see that as being deceived by bias. So there are all kinds of biases that we're subject to, which have been catalogued by cognitive psychology. And where this relates to absolutization, I think, is where we get either entirely deceived by the bias, or we react against it to say that the biased view is completely false. So obviously the biased view, whatever it is telling us something. So for example, we'll take the halo effect as a simple one. Yes, so where you see an attractive person and you think they're wonderful and they'll solve all your problems. That's a biased view of that person. You could be totally taken in by that and just treat them as the solution to all your problems and create more for yourself. Or you could totally react against that and take that person to be horrible and completely reject them, which of course would be equally unhelpful. They're complicated. So the biases have a close relationship with this, I think. There's a lot more I could say about biases. There'll be a whole book on that, but some other time. Then going round clockwise to representationalism. So representationalism is the understanding we can get by contrast, I think, from embodied meaning theory. So the recognition that the meaning of the symbols that we use, including language, but not restricted to language, comes from our bodies and the associative experiences we have. So the associations we make between symbols and experience in various ways. We form some of these associations with in infancy. So we learn what a dog is. Yeah, so we learn to associate the word dog with our experience of dogs, whatever that is. So we make those simple connections and associations, but of course the meaning of dog for you might depend on what your annoying pooch did yesterday, or how wonderful they were yesterday. So it's full of other associations. That meaning is a very rich and unique thing for each person who has that meaning. So any symbol is embodied. Now, from that perspective, recognizing meaning as embodied, we can also see that the traditional way of understanding meaning, which is still very dominant in our society, is frankly wrong. So representationalism is a broad term for it. So it's the assumption that propositions get their meaning from a relationship with reality. Just particularly that language in general really becomes meaningful when it's got at least a hypothetical relationship with reality. So in terms of the formal philosophy of the truth conditional theory, we understand what a sentence means when we understand the conditions when it could be true or false. Now that's one kind of statement of representationalism. There are others, but the general idea behind it is that we rely on a relationship with reality to get meaning. Now, what's wrong with this is that it assumes that belief that's prior to meaning. It ignores the implications, I think, of embodied meaning, which are that we have all kinds of senses of meaning, various kinds in our experience, long before we form it into sentences from the thought and make representations. So this assumption that meaning is dependent in some way on reality, on truth or falsehood, is the assumption that allows metaphysics. So metaphysics, going further in the diagram out to the right, which you could briefly just define as claims about reality. So the idea that we have a set of words, and this set of words tells us what's really the case, or what is true, or what is absolutely true, or what is absolutely false. So what's missing there is any kind of provisionality, any kind of recognition of the way in which our words are dependent on their meaning for us. So given that meaning was never absolute in the first place, and it was never about a one-to-one relationship between our symbols and the world or experience, it's a misconstruing of language and its significance, even to think in terms of claims about reality representing reality. So there's a basic mistake there. That's the link, I think, the dependency of metaphysics on representation. But metaphysics, when we get caught up in it, and that's very culturally based, we can get caught up in metaphysics just because everyone else is doing it and taking it for granted, is very difficult to separate from absolute judgment. So it continues to stimulate absolute judgment through the group which uses the metaphysical language, and of course it can express absolute groups of various kinds. So I think because we're so much in the habit of making absolute judgments, that gets kind of solidified in metaphysical claims, which continue to perpetuate absolutization. Now, the funny thing about metaphysics, well, it has all kinds of mechanisms for keeping itself going. Some of those are represented in the other details on the right-hand side of this diagram. So metaphysical claims are, if we look at the top, first of all, they're infinitely rationalizable. This is what we find a kind of ad hoc notary Scotsman type reasoning. So well, simple example of that is the notary Scotsman. So you've got a example of a Scotsman called Hamish, say, and Hamish claims no true Scotsman ever eats his porridge with sugar. And somebody comes along and says, but here's Jock. Jock eats his porridge with sugar, and he's a Scotsman, so surely your claim is wrong. And Hamish says, yeah, no, but Jock is no true Scotsman. Yeah, he can't be a real Scotsman if he eats his porridge with sugar. So there's no way he's going to let go of his belief. Yeah, simple example. It's ad hoc reasoning. There are lots of examples of this in pseudoscience, people just hanging on to certain beliefs and rationalizing them endlessly. But you get similar things in theology. Say, if you look at the defenses of God's existence against the common belief, something like that. Yeah, so there's God's existence is infinitely rationalizable because God is infinite, so he can do anything. So you can always say, well, it's God's will and we can't understand it in the end if God does something inconvenient. So this is a general point about metaphysical claims, that they're very easily sort of rationalized and defended through these entirely sort of abstract mechanisms that we've developed. Linked to that, also a couple of other things up there. So metaphysics is claimed to be inevitable. This is a response I often get when I talk about metaphysics, particularly to philosophers, they say, but you're using metaphysics yourself. It's inevitable. Everyone does it. I don't agree, obviously, because I think that confuses basic assumptions, usually with rigid assumptions or assumptions that are absolute assumptions. And I don't think our basic assumptions have to be absolute. We can always examine any belief we have if we need to. It's practically relevant to do so. However hard it may be to do so, it's not equally easy, of course. So I don't believe that metaphysics is inevitable, but there's obviously more complex arguments attached to that. There's also the inflation metaphysics. So it seems to be another feature that defense of metaphysics, that people think it's far more important in our lives than it really seems to be, as far as we can tell. So, for example, the particular classic case is that people think that metaphysics is the basis of value, the basis of our, we have to appeal to some absolute source of truth, for example, to know what's good. But our motivations and our values and so on come from our sense of meaning and our bodies, and our experience, very readily ascertained once you reflect on them and think about your experience when you have values. And your emotional states change, your body changes, you get motivated in various ways. So it's embodied. It doesn't come from this abstract realm of metaphysics somewhere else. That's a way in which it's a big distraction at best, but it can be a big manipulation, in fact. So now, just to put in a quick positive qualification there, there's a little thought bubble there with the idea that infinitely rationalizable, terms, I would say, rather than propositions, ideas, symbols that might be associated with claims about reality and metaphysics and infinity can be used as archetypes if you just focus on their meanings rather than claims about them. So I would distinguish between metaphysical claims about God, for example, and God as an archetypal symbol, similarly with the Buddha or any other kind of major archetypal symbol. It may have a very helpful role for you actually in countering absolutization if used in that way. But you have to be able to separate the meaning from the belief. Okay, going on around the diagram there. So metaphysics is connected by absolute deductive logic with other metaphysical claims. So metaphysical claims tend to come in clusters, and it's assumed that they're all linked together in a fireproof way, that one implies the other completely. So that also tends to lead to an assumption of complete systems of independence. So our the rational structures we create are assumed to be true by themselves, regardless of the wider context of our bodies, for example, in which they have arisen. Below the metaphysics is foundationalism and circularity, which is also how metaphysics tends to work. So foundationalism, the assumption that we've got certain true claims that must be true, and we build everything else on those. Classic philosophical example is Descartes' "I think, therefore I exist," which is he then builds the rest of his philosophy on. But there's the dogmatic assumption, so that starting point. But if your foundation is questioned and you need to justify it, then one ends up going around in a circle. So you try and justify it, but you end up basically just restating the metaphysical assumption in another form. And that ties into the ad hoc reasoning of the infinite rationalization I talked about earlier. Hamish, with his absolute belief that no true Scotsman could ever eat his porridge with sugar, is also engaging in circular reasoning, you know, he would carry on just defending that belief, using more and more examples that relate, depend on each other. Now, if you have that kind of approach, then another systems-related implication of that is fragility. So your absolute beliefs, well, they have a certain stability within limited conditions, like a fragile glass, say, as long as you don't subject that glass to certain kinds of stresses, then it might be okay. So we see with groups, say, that depend on absolutized beliefs. So like, you know, the Catholic Church seems like a good example to me. So they've got very rigid, absolute dogmatic beliefs that the organization depends on largely for its organizational needs. And then something goes wrong. So that leads to often a complete loss of faith, so-called, you know, the fragility of losing your religion, or the fragility of dramatic conversion, where somebody, you know, they don't slightly adjust their beliefs to the new circumstances that have come in. They find that they're completely inappropriate for those circumstances, so they have to change them dramatically to something else. So effectively, their belief is smashed by unexpected conditions. Okay, so going around the main clockwise, so we get to about 4 or 5 o'clock in the diagram, from the figure in the middle. Substitution is another important feature of absolutization. So now this relates to the theory of biases, particularly the idea that we often use easy methods or easy ways of thinking, particularly when harder ones would serve us better in the conditions we're in. Yeah, we may fall back on quick intuitions which are fine in certain circumstances, for example, but even in different complex circumstances where you need to actually stop and work it out and think in a difficult way. So you substitute the easy option for the harder one. And I think absolutization in general does that. So it substitutes an easier way of thinking for a harder one. So it's quite hard to get your head around, for example, God as archetypal meaning, rather than just, you know, this bloke who does sorts things out for you, this omnipotent bloke. That's in many ways easier, requires less cognitive complexity and development, generally speaking. So we go for the easy option. But that easier option then tends to let us down when new conditions come along. But that easy substitution also has a crucial role in group binding. So if you want to mobilize a group of people, get them all doing the same thing, particularly doing what you want, then what you want to do is get them all to believe the same thing. And if you can get them, a quick way of getting them to believe the same thing is to use an absolutization. So it's relatively easy to grasp because it's entirely abstracted. It doesn't depend on different people's experience, so they won't question it on the basis of their experience. So it becomes immune from questioning, effectively. You might question the general strategy, but you won't question the God who told you to fight the war. So the group binding stays relatively secure, as long, well, so it's still subject to fragility, of course. So group binding, there's all sorts of group dynamics and group psychology that follows from that, I think. And that's why absolutization is a tool of power and can be used in all sorts of manipulative ways. as we've seen in religious traditions and indeed in political or authoritarian approaches, and populism and so on. So, and final sort of key area is the denial of embodiment. So my argument is that absolute beliefs are disembodied. So they're disembodied in the sense of taking us away from embodied meaning, particularly as a starting point. Yeah, so taking us away from the recognition that meaning in our lives is dependent on our bodies and our experience, the experience we've had with our bodies. But connected to that, there's various other kinds of disembodiments, which are also substitutions of something easier or more abstract for something harder. So at the top there, we've got substitution of concepts for experience, say. So rather than going through the difficulty of, say, a religious experience and recognizing it as an experience, which may be very powerful and important, you substitute for concepts. Oh yeah, I got a message from God. Okay, I know what to do now. Then next one, God's eye view or perspective. So instead of recognizing we have a perspective which is specific to us, we assume that we have the God's eye view, that we know everything. So we omnipotent perspective. And that's a very easy one, maybe for some kinds of scientists, maybe they fall into this belief that your view is objective in an absolute sense. Substitution of literalism for metaphor. So metaphor is what connects the meaning of all sorts of words and symbols to our bodily experience by connecting one set of associations with another, sort of rooting meaning in our experience in some way, even when it's abstract. But substituting literalism, so literalism is all about the belief that our words are connected to reality. Substituting signs for symbols. So signs are, this is in the Jungian senses of signs and symbols. So signs mean one thing. Sign is precise. So a red traffic light means stop, and that's all it means. But a symbol is ambiguous, and so we may interpret what we come across as a sign rather than a symbol. We will be blind to its ambiguity if we're thinking absolutely. So symbols are obviously can be very, very, very rich and ambiguous. You know, so take the Buddha symbol, for instance. We can substitute values for desires. So we may have all sort of highly rationalized values, which have been very abstract justifications. But that kind of substitutes for recognizing that we have desires and that actually our values are motivated by our desires. And the absolute belief substituted for embodied confidence. So again, the assumption that we need some certainty to base our actions on, rather than just the experience of having worked in a particular way, and certain things have worked for us in our experience, and certain beliefs have served for us, so we become more confident in. And finally, discontinuity. So disembodiment might lead us to assume we can make instantaneous changes, whether to ourselves or anybody else. We can have a revolution which will completely change the world immediately, even though it's incredibly complex and there are all sorts of adjustments to be made. So again, there's a lot that could be said about that. So anyway, so that gives you perhaps just an overall taste of some of the connections in the idea of absolutization and the ways in which it connects with, I haven't gone through those 5 sort of disciplinary approaches here, but should be able to relate those to them. Yes, so I've mentioned how Buddhism's the idea of proliferation and the idea of the middle way come from Buddhism, particularly. See the psychology here, neuroscience, reptilian brain, projection, substitution, bias, that kind of stuff. Involved in embodiment, particularly with embodied meaning, embodied meaning theory. Also the left-right brain hemispheres, brain life and relation, flow, cast a lot of light on that. And then systems theory. So the whole idea of fragility, particularly, and reinforcing feedback loops, and the idea of assumed system independence. Those are all closely related to systems theory. Okay, I better stop. I've gone on longer than I intended to there, but I did make approximate predictions how long I would go on. Anyway, so let me throw things open to questions or comments, anything you want to respond with.
Well, just thank you very much for this overview, and I can't wait to read the book. So I'm looking forward to that, and I like your clarity, and I enjoyed your presentation very much. And I only allotted an hour, so I'm going to have to go.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming soon.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Anybody else?
Thanks for that, Robert. For me, I was reflecting on I work in medicine, so obviously, and that's my kind of area. And I was recently teaching some medical students, because mental health is my specialist area. And I was recently teaching some medical students how to assess people's mental health. And we started talking about ideas, beliefs, delusion. And I started trying to discuss with them, the relative nature of, on a very basic level of, this, because, sort of this is a spectrum of when does an idea become a belief and when does a belief become a delusion? And what do we mean in medicine by delusion? Which is, a fascinating area in itself. It has its own, because it has its own structure and its own. So, I just wonder, what your thoughts on that one, because it seems to be that's the difficulty, is kind of, for me, what I was saying, a lot of this is socially, basically socially constructed. What is an idea? What is a belief? What is a delusion? There's also the emotional content behind it, the emotional reaction behind it. In medicine, we talk about delusional intensity. So delusional intensity means it's, there's almost like an energetic power behind the idea that it's just unable to be rationalized, or kind of you can't have any sort of rational conversation with that person to try and break that belief. So it seems to be a similar sort of area. So I just wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
So do you mean about how I would understand delusion? What?
Yeah, like the word delusion, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, I think what we need to do as far as possible is to get away from the assumption that delusion is false in some absolute ways, or our reliance on the absolutizations of truth and falsity to navigate that. Obviously, it's a rough and ready way of understanding delusion, which people often need to fall back on in practice. But I think in moments of reflection, at least, we need to start thinking about it in a more sophisticated way. And that's where I would see delusion as something that is not justifiable. So the idea of justification rather than truth, I think is very important. So the justification is incremental. You can have degrees of justification, whereas a claim is either true or it isn't. You've got this simplicity, absoluteness about the idea of truth. you can't really have a half-truth. I mean, a half-truth technically is not a truth. But a justification can actually be incremental. So a delusion then would be a poorly justified belief. And the justifications come from a weight of evidence and experience, which could be primary, our own personal experience, but also secondary, what people have told us, what we've learned, and of course, consistency with the beliefs we have otherwise previously. And also, I think crucially, the kind of test of proof analysis. So another kind of way of testing delusion is there any way of challenging this? So you can hold an absolutized delusion and endlessly rationalize it. And so one of the tests is there's no actual way of challenging it, of using experience to make a mark on it. Because the person with the delusion is locked into that world and can't engage with the kind of processes they need to question it. So whether that absolutization is due to a mental illness in some cases, or whether it's more within our control or whatever, it's obviously another question. That's where I see the link.
Yeah, no, I see it like that as well. And the extreme ends of the scale are quite easier to recognize. I mean, if somebody says, I believe I can fly and I'm going to try and throw myself off this building right now, that's most people would say that's a delusion. It's the grey areas in the middle, especially around religious belief, especially around societally conditioned beliefs. And we often talk about that, like, because it's interesting, a lot of people with mental health problems and psychosis, their delusional beliefs usually nearly always center around either paranoid beliefs around fear, or around religious or spiritual beliefs. And it's nearly, it's just fascinating to me. There's always goes down that road. So it's obviously something hardwired in there that's ready to go down those roads, really. So,
yeah. Well, Ian McGilchrist is fascinating on this. I don't know, have you looked at Ian McGilchrist's latest book, the big one? No, I mean the Master and His Emissary has some stuff on this, but his more recent one, The Matter with Things, the first section of that has a lot of detail on particularly the relationship between schizophrenia, particularly, but other kinds of mental illnesses, and left hemisphere dominance. And left hemisphere dominance is closely associated also with this kind of assumption of system independence, that we're somehow separate. We don't have to modify our understanding from anywhere else. We've got a sort of self-consistent, absolutely right set of beliefs. And that seems to be very symptomatic of the state, as I understand it, without direct experience of it, of schizophrenics. Anyone else like to come in?
Robert, I am thinking of something that a situation that I'm in, that I'm thinking of your presentation and looking forward to reading this book. And I'm wondering if it's going to help me with this. Try to be brief about this. I'm in a situation, a group that's studying a text, and most of the people in the group are reading this text in a very literal way. And I read it poetically. I read it as having a lot of different meaning. And I guess I'm asking how to talk across that kind of difference of perspective. I mean, I'm wondering if my perspective is somehow distorted because I'm not bridging this in some way. But anyway, do you have anything that you can comment on about this situation?
Yeah, I mean, see, some of this depends on features of character and temperament and psychological development and stuff like this. But I suppose with literalism, one approach I might make practically is to see if there are other contexts where people are not literalistic. And very often that might well be they watch a film, say, and they don't actually think that the hero is actually in that situation, as it were. They don't need it in that literalistic way. So if we can find analogies, yeah, I mean, if I get into discussion with people about interpretation of religious texts, say, I often make parallels with the arts and novels and so on. You know, why do you think the Buddha is so different from Gandalf, for example? You know, they're both archetypal figures with this power, and although their precise implications and advice may be different, of course, but the overall significance of them to us in practice may be quite similar. So if we can find that in our experience of things we acknowledge to be metaphorical or in the realm of the imagination, then maybe we can then gradually extend it to challenge literalism.
Yeah, I like the idea of bringing in different contexts, you know, saying that there are more contexts available for us to explore something. Yeah, thank you.
I've had the opposite experiences in my own tradition, which is because I am, I just tend towards literalism, and I know I do that. But also people like reading. I've been in study groups with spiritual texts, where a particular spiritual text I remember, and everyone was saying, "Oh, it's so beautiful, it's so poetic," and I was like, "Well, I see it as an instruction manual. Literally, there's one person in this text that is telling the other person in this text, do this, try this, look at this, do that." And what I've been doing is doing that and taking that and doing it. And everyone was looking at me like I was mad, because they were reading it as this beautiful poetic thing. So again, I was struggling to kind of bridge that gap. But but that's why I used to like those study groups, because you'd have a mix of people with different approaches to things, and then that's how you kind of, it'd be very frustrating at times, but you'd kind of come to some sort of middle way.
Yes.
Yeah, I think wherever you start, the challenge is finding different possibilities. So to try and avoid an absolutized interpretation, think about different ways you could interpret it. And if that is, if there's a particular sort of fixed metaphorical interpretation, can turn into allegory, which is just like this story means this, and that can be equally rigid to a literal interpretation. Suddenly I find that in some of the traditional interpretations of the Buddha's similes, for example, written about this in the Buddha's Middle Way, that if you interpret them as metaphors, then actually there's going to be a range of interpretation possible, including perhaps more direct practical interpretations as well as. But it's not just allegorical, so there can't just be one kind of fixed meaning to it. Anyone else like to come in with questions or comments?
So Robert, I'm going to ask an American question. So I love the way that you integrate general systems theory and Buddhism and Greek philosophy and a whole other variety of fields, neuropsychology and so forth. But I'm wondering whether you find any resonance with what you're writing with John Dewey's version of pragmatism and his view of open inquiry and his pragmatic a view of truth. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Okay, a lot of resonance, yeah, in what I've read of Dewey. Yeah, I mean, my approach is pragmatist in a broad sense, and if I was to find a philosopher, a pragmatist philosopher that I had a sort of a lot of sympathy for, it would be Dewey, probably more than the others. But yeah, I don't go along with pragmatist interpretation of truth for an entirely pragmatic reason. So I think it's important not to dilute the sense of truth. So I think, I think perhaps the basic reason for that is about the absoluteness in the way that we most basically use it. I mean, this applies not just to truth, but also to the term knowledge and the term reality. That it's a toggle switch. You know, either you've got it or you haven't. And when people sort of loosely use it in an incremental way, I'm not always sure what they mean or whether that incrementalism is actually consistent very often. It's actually been thought out what they mean by a half truth, for example. And I suppose the other aspect of this is that I think if we're going to deal with absolutization and reduce it in practice, then we have to be able to recognize it. And if we use the terminology in a way which is confusing, actually that makes it harder to recognize. Yeah, when people make claims of truth, obviously you have to look at the context, you know, when you're interpreting what somebody says, and you know, I'm not immune from using the terms truth and knowledge and so on. Sometimes I use those archetypally, which is reasonably easy to frame. You know, I'm inspired by the idea of truth as an archetype. But there's also like a common sense use, so you can see from the context that people are using it in this way. But there are also lots of situations where people fairly clearly from the context do mean truth or knowledge or whatever in an absolute way. And the sort of pragmatic interpretation of that sort of serious, often philosophical use of those terms does seem to me often an attempt to evade recognizing absolutization and its implications. So my approach is very much to try and recognize absolutization squarely, which sometimes means disentangling the language, not policing the language. There's lots of issues with that, but just trying to disentangle it when we can, and then be clear about what one is trying to avoid, basically, by having clear labels for it, and then one can, but obviously one also needs serviceable alternative terms for what people are, I think, trying to do with terms like pragmatic truth. So justification, I think, usually serves the purpose, but also meaning and distinguishing meaning from belief, I think, is an important aspect of how I would often attempt to disentangle these things. Does that make any sense? You're muted, Seth.
Yeah, I just said thank you.
All right. Yeah. I mean, do come back to me if you want to challenge further.
Yeah, well, I was just looking at Dewey's view of saying, well, this is what seems to work right now, so we'll call it true, but we always have to leave it subject to further inquiry because it may not be true tomorrow, or we may discover it's only a partial truth tomorrow, or we may want to totally discard it tomorrow. So I think he had that kind of very true never was with a capital T for Dewey. It was always something we accept that seems workable right now, but is subject to change and revision.
Yeah.
And so I always appreciated that attitude towards things.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if you're studying Dewey or maybe talking with Deweyians, then you've got to sort of work with that language. But certainly in the long run, I feel it's better to have a clearer language, which is why I tried to use one. But certainly I'd want to make as full use as possible of Dewey and his insights, because I mean, I could certainly would like to study it more in the future than I have. So another project in the future is to go more into Dewey. So yeah, maybe I should just flag up a few things to finish off with. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the book's part of the series, so will be followed up in February next year, which is now the scheduled date for the 5 Principles, which is the follow-up positive book. So I'm glad that it's coming out so quickly, really, in relation to this one. So we've got the positive together with the negative. Anyway, so if you're interested, do look out for that, because I'll probably do another book launch for that in February or so. In the meantime, yes, I think I mentioned in the email I sent out that you can order the book at a discount. You go directly to the publisher's website, Religion. Yeah, so and also maybe I should flag up that next year I will be doing a sequence of talks with discussions on the Middle Way network, which is open to anyone sort of seriously interested in discussing and exploring the Middle Way, and that will be focused on the 5 Principles and exploring the 5 Principles. But obviously those are also, absolutization will be part of the discussion as well, I expect, because that will also be what we're trying to respond to. Okay, so I'll leave it there.
I have one last comment that I wanted to make. Was I was very touched by your remark about Equinox being willing to publish a complex philosophical study like this. I thought that was wonderful. I'm glad you found a publisher to be supportive and to do this, and for us too.
Well, so am I. I'm immensely grateful to him. I mean, as you can see, it's taken a long time. I'm now, well, 21 years after the completion of my PhD thesis, I finally found sort of respectable publishing for this work. So that's a good thing for me. Yeah. So thanks to everyone for coming along, and hope to see you again in the future.